In football, fans believe one thing above all, that what they're watching is real. 90 minutes, 2 teams, one outcome decided on the pitch. But what if that outcome was decided before kickoff? In the Czech Republic, that question is no longer hypothetical. Because in a sweeping operation, police didn't just investigate a player. They detained dozens of individuals. Not one mistake, not one bad call. A network, a system, a hidden layer operating beneath the surface of football. This wasn't happening in packed stadiums under global lights. It was happening in lower-tier leagues, where cameras are fewer, oversight is weaker, and scrutiny is almost non-existent. But the games, they still matter. Because even in smaller leagues, bets are placed, money flows, and where money flows, opportunity follows. According to investigators, this wasn't random. It was organized, structured, deliberate. Games potentially influenced not by skill, but by agreement. Decisions made off the pitch, outcomes shaped before the whistle. Because match fixing doesn't always look obvious. It doesn't require a player to miss an open goal. Sometimes it's subtle. A penalty conceded at the right moment. A defensive lapse that feels just slightly off. A sequence of plays that individually seem normal, but together tell a different story. And that's what makes it dangerous. Because fans don't always see it. They feel it. A moment that doesn't quite add up. A result that seems just a little too convenient. But by then, it's already done. The bet is placed. The outcome delivered. The system paid. And behind it all, a network operating quietly. Until now. Because when police move in and detain dozens of people, it sends a message. This isn't suspicion anymore. This is exposure. At first, it looks contained. A police operation in the Czech Republic. Lower tier leagues. Dozens detained. But corruption in football doesn't stay local. It spreads. Because the moment match fixing is exposed, every match starts to feel different. Not just in one league, but everywhere. That's the first ripple. Doubt. Fans begin to question what they're watching. Was that mistake real? Was that goal earned? Or was something else at play? And once that doubt enters, it doesn't leave easily. Because football is built on belief. The belief that anything can happen. That underdogs can win. That outcomes are uncertain. But match fixing destroys that uncertainty. It replaces it with control, with predictability, with something far more dangerous, predetermined results. Then comes the pressure on the system. Organizations across Europe begin paying attention. Because if a network can operate in one country, it can operate in another. Leagues connected through players, agents, and competitions are never fully isolated. That's why bodies like UEFA and FIFA take these cases seriously. Not just because of what's been uncovered, but because of what it might lead to. Investigations like this raise uncomfortable questions. How many games were affected? How long has this been happening? Who else might be involved? Because organized betting networks don't act randomly. They target vulnerability, lower leagues, financially pressured players, matches with less visibility, places where influence is easier, and detection is harder. That's the second ripple. Exposure of weakness. Not just in one league, but in the structure of the sport itself. Then comes the third ripple. Money. Because betting markets don't care about league size. A match in a small division can still attract global bets. And if outcomes are influenced, those markets become tools, used by those who already know the result. That creates an uneven playing field, not just for players, but for everyone involved in the ecosystem. Fans, bettors, clubs, all operating under the assumption of fairness. An assumption that's now under pressure. That's the ripple effect. It starts with arrests, but it doesn't end there. It spreads into perception, into trust, into the very idea of competition. Because once people begin to believe that games can be controlled, the question is no longer, who will win? It becomes, was it ever real to begin with? Match fixing at this level isn't random. It's organized, structured, calculated, And in the case unfolding in the Czech Republic, that's exactly what authorities are trying to dismantle. Because behind every fixed match, there's usually a system. Not just players, but intermediaries. People who connect teams to betting networks, who identify vulnerable matches, who coordinate outcomes without drawing attention. It often starts with selection, not high-profile games, but lower-tier matches, less coverage, less scrutiny, more opportunity. Then comes the approach, a player, a referee, sometimes multiple individuals, not always forced, sometimes persuaded, because at lower levels, financial pressure is real. Salaries are smaller, careers are unstable, and the offer? Just enough to make someone consider it. That's how the system finds its entry point. Then comes execution. And this is where it gets subtle, because modern match fixing doesn't always aim for obvious outcomes. It targets specific moments. A goal in the first half, a certain number of corners, a penalty at a precise time. These are called micro-events, harder to detect, easier to control, and perfect for betting markets that allow wagers on nearly every aspect of a game. That's how the system operates, quietly, efficiently. But here's the problem for those running it. Every action leaves a trace, not always on the field, but in the data. Betting markets are constantly monitored. Unusual patterns trigger alerts. Sudden spikes in bets, odds shifting before anything happens in the match. Activity that doesn't match public information. That's where investigators begin. They track the data, compare it with match events, analyze timing. Because if bets are placed before a suspicious moment occurs, it suggests prior knowledge, and prior knowledge points to coordination. That's how cases like this start to unravel. Piece by piece, authorities combine betting data, communication records, witness statements, until the pattern becomes clear. And when it does, the response is no longer quiet. It becomes visible. Raids, detentions, dozens of individuals taken into custody. Because once the network is exposed, it can't operate in the shadows anymore. That's the investigation. Not just catching individuals, but breaking a system. One that depends on secrecy, timing, and the assumption that no one is watching closely enough. Until now. Then it happens. Not quietly, not behind the scenes, but all at once. Doors knocked on, phones seized, people detained. In the Czech Republic, what had been operating in the shadows suddenly became visible. Dozens taken in, a coordinated police action. And just like that, the system felt it. Because for those involved, the risk had always been calculated. Stay subtle, avoid attention, keep it controlled. But this wasn't control. This was exposure. And exposure changes everything. For the individuals detained, the consequences are immediate. Interrogations, investigations, possible charges. Careers don't just pause, they collapse. Because in football, even suspicion at this level is enough. Clubs distance themselves, leagues react, reputations disappear almost overnight. That's the first impact. Personal, direct, irreversible. But the bigger consequence spreads outward, into locker rooms across leagues. Because news like this travels fast. Players hear about it, officials hear about it, and suddenly, the risk feels real. What once seemed like a quiet opportunity now looks like a direct path to being caught. That's the second impact. Fear, not panic, but awareness. Because when dozens are detained at once, it sends a message louder than any warning ever could. This is being watched, and not just locally. Cases like this attract attention from organizations like UEFA and FIFA. Because if a network is active in one region, it could be connected to others. That raises the stakes. What started as a national investigation becomes part of a larger effort to protect the game. Then comes the third impact, disruption. Because networks like this rely on continuity, trust between participants, reliable communication, predictable patterns. But once arrests begin, that structure breaks. People stop talking. Connections go silent. Operation Stall. Because no one knows who might be next. That's how systems collapse. Not always from the outside, but from within, under pressure, under scrutiny, under the weight of consequence. And in that moment, the balance shifts from control to survival. In the end, this wasn't just a police operation. It was a revelation, because what happened in the Czech Republic didn't just expose individuals. It exposed a possibility that football, the game watched by millions, can be influenced in ways most people never see. And that's the real impact. Not just the arrests, not just the investigation, but the question it leaves behind. How much of what we watch is truly unpredictable? Because football is built on uncertainty. That's what makes it powerful. A last-minute goal, an underdog victory, a moment that no one could have scripted. But when match fixing enters the picture, even at lower levels, that uncertainty begins to fade. It gets replaced by something else. Control, planning, outcomes shaped before the whistle. And once that idea takes hold, it changes everything. Because fans don't just watch football for results. They watch for authenticity, for the belief that what's happening is real, earned, unscripted. That's what gives the game meaning. That's what makes it more than just numbers on a scoreboard. And that's exactly what corruption threatens. Not just fairness, but belief itself. That's why cases like this matter. Because they force the system to respond, to adapt, to tighten oversight, to monitor more closely, to close the gaps that allowed something like this to exist. Organizations like UEFA and FIFA don't just react to scandals. They evolve because of them. Stronger regulations, better monitoring systems, greater cooperation across borders. Because in modern football, integrity isn't static. It's constantly under pressure, and it has to keep up. But here's the truth. No system is perfect. There will always be attempts, always be vulnerabilities, always be individuals willing to take the risk. That's the reality. So the real endgame isn't eliminating corruption completely. It's limiting it, detecting it, punishing it, and protecting the core of the game, trust. Because without trust, football becomes predictable. And when it becomes predictable, it stops being football. It becomes something else entirely. A performance, a script, a system controlled from the outside. And that's what this story warns us about. Not just what happened, but what could happen again if the system isn't watched, if the gaps aren't closed, if the game isn't protected. Because in the end, the real question isn't just who won. It's whether the game was ever fair to begin with.